Thank you all for joining us for the Difficult Conversations and Conflict Resolution Workshop. Joining us today are Jonathan Osborne, business litigation shareholder and co-chair of the firm's white-collar criminal defense and internal investigations practice group at Gunster Corporate Law Firm, Randy Gabe, VP of Gas Resources at Southwest Gas, Marty Weiner, Vice President at MGM Resorts Event Productions, and Nicholas Fear, VP at TD Industries. So they are going to be helping us identify common challenges encountered between individuals in a variety of environments and provide us with some strategies to resolve and minimize conflicts. So I'm going to hand it over to them to introduce themselves and then tell us a bit about their background, and then we'll open it up to questions. Jonathan, will you please get us started?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I live in South Florida, actually Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which is where I am today. I'm a former running rebel. I played basketball at UNLV back in 2002, and then was a graduate school graduate in 2008, and then went to law school at Georgetown, and now I practice law in Florida, which was my home before moving to Las Vegas during high school. And it's great to see you all.
Thank you. Marty, would you go next?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, I'm Marty Weiner. I am the Vice President of MGM Resort.
Marty, you just went on mute.
Oh, that's weird. Marty Weiner, I'm Vice President of MGM Resorts Event Productions, which is MGM Resorts' in-house design and decor firm, as well as the group that delivers all of the event productions across MGM Resorts. I am a rather to Las Vegas and have been here now about 2.5 years and have been recently been engaged in the graduate school and am excited to be here today and part of this community.
Thank you so much. Nicholas? Oh, Nicholas, you're on mute.
Hey everyone, my name is Nicholas Fair, and I'm a running rebel from '99 to 2000, graduated at the College of Engineering, Mechanical Engineering, and worked in Vegas up till 2018, building big resorts on the Strip. I was really fortunate to have those big projects and those big teams on the Strip. Now we live in Austin for 3 years doing the same thing. Austin is booming right now, and excited to be here, but always a rebel at heart.
Thank you. And Randy?
Hi, I'm Randy Gabe. I'm the Vice President of Gas Resources at Southwest Gas. I'm also a running rebel. I graduated before Nicholas and Jonathan. I'll just leave it at that. And I certainly did not play basketball, although I did attend some pretty amazing games while I was there. I have 25 years or so of utility industry experience at different organizations and at different levels. And I also work for a construction company and a .com company and an equipment company. So slightly varied background. Happy to be here.
Thank you all so much. We're so excited to get your advice and suggestions on this topic. So to kind of get us started, and this is kind of before we get to that conflict portion, what are some things that we can do to help build rapport in the beginning of a new group or team that's coming together? And whoever wants to start us off.
I can start. I was very fortunate to be part of really big teams, and building trust from the get-go is very, very important. What we used to do is, especially before we start a big mega $1 million project, we used to get all the team together in one room. This is your project managers, your superintendents, your estimators, the partners out that going to be building the job, get them all in one room and do some sort of a Myers-Briggs test or a personality assessment and share it amongst the team and have fun with it. The more we know about each other, the more the trust is going to build, the more the collaboration is going to be down the road. So the first thing we do is build trust quickly by using these exercises that share a lot about ourselves and who we are and how we click and don't click. And that way, the team's trust built quickly.
I would just go ahead, Mike.
Oh, no, go ahead. Absolutely.
After you. I'm going on mute.
Marty, you're on mute.
There we go. There we go. I did the same thing. So I just to build on that, the one thing I'd add is, if I were to prioritize, I too think the two things building on the trust are alignment and transparency for that team. And if you are the leader of that group, making sure that what the goal is, why that team exists, what project we're driving towards, etc., is clear. Right. And transparency, right? I think it's very important for a group to get together, no matter if they're peers, subordinates, casual participants, volunteers, understanding that I may not be able to tell you everything at every moment, but having transparency about what we can share, where our status is, how we're doing, helps to build that trust. But also helps to understand that, okay, if there's a misunderstanding or if there's something that is the potential to cause conflict somewhere down the road, the expectations to start with and the alignment on that, that everybody is pointed in the same direction will be helpful because it becomes your North Star. And if things start to go left, right, and sideways, you can bring folks back to that conversation and try and find some common ground on your shared initial goals. Things change, evolve, personalities come into play, but recognizing we started off aligned is, I've personally found, is always a good place to start.
I would agree with what Nicholas and Marty both said. Starting from a place of trust is essential in all relationships. In fact, I think that'll probably be a common theme among the group today. Totally agree on alignment. But building that trust, I don't think there's really any shortcuts there. It takes time. I like what Nicholas said with the Myers-Briggs. That's a good way to kind of find out how people think and their different personalities. But it does take time to build a team, to build that rapport, and to build that trust.
And I'll just add that in thinking about building trust, especially if you are in a leadership position on any particular team, and this seems obvious, but it's actually a skill that it has to be exercised. But asking good questions and actually sticking around to listen and internalize the answers that the people on your team give you at the beginning stage, but throughout the execution of a project. And I think that's true on the business side of things, but also on the law side of things, where I'm providing counsel to clients. It's critical that as sometimes the team leader or the front of the room, that I invite feedback, listen to the feedback, and incorporate the feedback going forward.
Thank you all. So to kind of go deeper, when you are the leader of a team, how important is it for you to get to know each member one-on-one, so that as situations arise, you're aware of how to best reach each person because you kind of know their work style and communication style. Maybe Randy, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So if I'm working in a team like my team, the people that report to me, or a smaller team, it is absolutely essential to get to know everybody personally. At least that's my style. I really enjoy getting to know people, and that's my way of building that rapport and building that trust. But depending on where you are in an organization and the size of the team, you just may not have that opportunity. If you're the CEO of a large company, they're still your team, but you're not going to have that one-on-one relationship with hundreds or thousands of employees. So you need to take a different approach. You still need, as Marty said earlier, you still need to come with that transparency, integrity. You need to walk the walk. You need to be that genuine person, and then people will listen to you, listen to your message and what you have to say. I also agree with Marty on the clarity of the goals and the vision and getting everybody to buy in. I think that's essential. But if you do have the opportunity to be in a smaller group, to me, getting everybody to know one-on-one is actually absolutely essential.
Thank you. Jonathan, would you like to add anything?
Sure, I agree with Randy, and it's been interesting, at least in Florida, and I'm sure it's like this in other parts of the country, including where you all are. It's been very interesting to see how the challenges of getting to know colleagues on a personal level has evolved in light of the pandemic. And so I know at our firm, there are sort of natural relationships that are maybe more easy to maintain, the people that are on your day-to-day immediate team, but it's taken more innovation and calls like this one actually to connect across the law firm, across offices in the midst of the pandemic. So I'll just say basically that the coronavirus has created growth opportunities for each of us as members and leaders of teams who are trying to do what Randy just talked about.
Thanks, Jonathan. Marty, did you want to add something?
Sure. I think that this question is an important segue to a different topic for another day, but largely depends on your executive presence, right? You might, to Randy's point and Jonathan's follow-up, not have the opportunity because the team is large, because you're in remote locations, the circumstances don't lend themselves to it. But this is a really good opportunity especially if you're a leader or an emerging leader, to build your executive presence. And, and people forget that executive presence really depends on a two-way street. The first is the message you're putting out into the universe, your values, your personal brand. But the second part is understanding what that audience needs out of it and what they can hear and what they're willing to listen to, etc., and what's truly in it for them as a value proposition. So if you don't have that opportunity to build those one-on-ones, understanding the importance of your executive presence as a team lead will go a long way in that. And even if people don't have that one-on-one, they feel like they know you and can trust you and can get on board with that. So it doesn't sound like things are coming across from a stranger or somebody that feels very separate from what they are working on in their day-to-day.
Did you want to add something, Nicholas?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I was waiting for you to call me. There's a lot of insight that my colleagues have provided. For me, it's especially with my direct reports, is invaluable to build that one-on-one relationship. Actually, I had a lot of my direct reports at my home. I've been invited to their homes. And over the years, I've been to weddings, baptisms, bar mitzvahs, you mention it. I feel, and again, this is my experience, I felt that having a strong personal relationship built a whole lot better teams, and we all had each other's back, and we did a lot of great work with that. Pre-COVID, I used to love the managing by walking around. And, even though I kept a close relationship with my direct reports on a personal level, the people that are remote from them, second and third direct reports, I made a note that I drop by their offices and do a chit chat for like 5 or 6 minutes. And then I make sure to run back to my office and write down who I spoke with and what we spoke about. That way it registers in my mind. My memory isn't that strong with having 250 employees in our office. So I make sure that I write down what personal thing they've done, what family trip they've done. It seems like the personal things resonate a whole lot more than the work. Even though we chat about work for 5 minutes and ask about personal things for one, I just make sure that I write it down, and next time I remember that I spoke with that person on that topic and bring it up. It always brings that rapport, but it's very important to have that personal relationship.
Thank you so much. So as we're on this topic of team building, we have a question in the chat. What is an effective way for building trust in a remote work environment? Nicholas, do you want to start us off since you just went?
Sure. It's been quite a challenge since about a year ago we went all remote. It's not only building trust with the team, building trust with your clients, and developing business as you're trying to do these multiple person Zoom calls or WebEx. My style is even though we're doing these 5 or 10 people WebEx, is to call that person on a separate phone call and have those introduction meetings or something like that before we get into that group setting or after we get that group setting. I found that one-on-one interaction builds trust a whole lot better. But also we've done some virtual lunches or virtual happy hours where I send my clients or my colleagues Grubhub gift cards and things like that, and they would go buy out their food, and we time it out so we're all eating together or all having happy hour drinks together and coordinated that way. So it's not as effective as seeing eyeball to eyeball, but it does work.
That's great. Thank you. Marty, did you want to add anything?
No, you know what? I'm going to defer to my co-panelists, but I'm interested in what Jonathan was saying before about how this has provided some opportunity for innovation in this space. So I'd actually love to hear what they've been doing that is innovative and how that impacts both the industry and sort of the environment that you're in.
Great. We'll hand it over to Jonathan.
Sure. So, and I'm going to circle back to the discussion about alignment and transparency. So at the corporate level, what I've seen be most effective, even in the virtual era of managing and leading teams, is to basically have almost like at our firm, for example, we've had basically state of the firm discussions at multiple times, more often than we usually would. And there's a couple of reasons for that. We've had a lot of uncertainty in business and for people who've lost jobs, people who've lost family members. We've had tragic loss within our law firm family. And so I want to zoom out and say that the context for the transparency takes on different forms in the sense that it's not just about business objectives. It's not just about the health of the firm from a financial standpoint. It's also been about talking about grief and talking about ways to cope with the challenges that people feel at home, as well as within their law firm family, about how we're going to get through this and how we'll do it together. So that's one example of how maybe in the past where someone suffered a loss, it would have been a very private loss, not one that would have been known necessarily by the entire company. But now, because of the complications of COVID, we're all kind of woven together in one strand of loss. It may not be in my personal family, but if a colleague is suffering from that, it becomes a corporate loss. And so this is not one of the things that I really thought specifically about, but I think it is responsive to the question in that leaders and managers have had to innovate their presence to deliver a message of empathy, a message of connection over a screen in a small box on people's laptops around the company and around the country. So that's one way that I can think of.
Yeah, and I think that to add to that, I think that that's right. I think that that empathy and the ability to demonstrate vulnerability and et cetera really do actually, it's a really good point, add to that building of trust, which build right back to, in the long run, if people feel like they are part of something larger, that their work and community families have been there to support them. If you reach a point of conflict or negotiation, you're coming at it with a better perspective of thinking, okay, these are people who have been here for me, and I am more inclined to listen better, be in tune, and be more willing to come to a compromise.
Agreed.
Randy, did you want to add anything to that?
Those are all excellent examples, excellent points. One thing that I've been concerned about is taking maybe a step back from trust. One component of that is corporate culture. So when we started working remotely, like everybody else, about March last year, the utility industry, we have 15, 20, 30-year employees there. It's very common. We all know each other really well, and this culture is deeply ingrained in us. So taking a 15-year employee and suddenly they're working remote, no problem. We already know them. We've already built that rapport. It's very easy to go remote because that trust has already been built. But to have somebody new to the organization come in, how do you impose that culture upon them. I don't want to say indoctrinate because that always has a very negative tone to it. But our corporate culture is very important and actually one that I'm very proud of. How do you instill somebody new coming in, somebody right out of university maybe that really doesn't have a lot of work experience? How do you instill that corporate culture in them? I think it's very, very difficult, and it's not a problem that we've solved, quite honestly. But I had an employee that we hired I want to say about 2 months ago. I just met her virtually last week, and it was the first time I met her. And that's not like me. I like to meet people face to face and get to know them, just like Nicholas said. I think that's really important. So figuring out a way to maintain this corporate culture is a challenge. When we go back to work, we've already decided that we're going to keep some remote work as part of as an option for folks. So many of our employees that can work remote will be able to work remote 2 or 3 days a week. So there's even fewer people in the office. So having those hallway conversations, you don't have them. Having the meeting after the meeting or the meeting before the meeting, you don't really have that opportunity in this virtual world. And it's very concerning to me that we can't. It's going to be harder. It's going to be more challenging to pass along that corporate culture, which trust is a huge component. So I wish I had the only other advice I could have, which is very practical, is turn your camera on. People can see your face; they're far more engaged. So no matter what I look like, I put my camera on in every meeting. I don't know. It matters to me.
Thanks so much. So we have gotten some really great tips regarding how to build a rapport and trust among our teams. So now let's segue a bit to discussing the art of coming to a compromise. How do you begin to find a middle ground, and how do you get everyone to agree, if that is even possible? Nicholas, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Early on in my career, I was very fortunate to attend a lot of negotiating classes and all of that. The one example that comes to mind, and it really, when the light bulb came on, we participated in an exercise called the orange exercise. And it's an exercise comprised of 3 people. One person has an orange that's really interested in the skin of the orange, but no one else knew what the interest is. The other person is interested in the pulp, and the third person is interested in the juice of the orange. So that exercise really opened up my mind, and I saw a lot of examples where a lot of good people failed at negotiating because they wanted the whole orange instead of compromising on the part that they wanted. So really, it developed me asking a lot of open-ended questions in terms of why is that orange of interest to you, and understanding what is the interest or the stakehold that you have in that particular orange, and find out if it aligns with what I want or in conflict with what I want. So I learned early on, I was very fortunate to ask a lot of questions before making negotiations and understanding what is at stake here, what are the different parties interested in, and how can we agree on common grounds and make it a win-win across the board, because that is the most successful type of negotiation for me, is making a win versus a compromise. So that's kind of how I started my journey, and I read a lot of books about negotiating, but it's just asking a lot of open-ended questions, not leading questions, that helps with that.
Thank you. Marty, do you want to add anything?
Sure. So I think that's a great level set and a really good visual for all of us with multiple components of those oranges. I think that if we're starting a negotiation, I think the first real piece of that is, who's at the table and why are they there? Is it important? What are the goals here? Is it important that we come to a compromise? Is there an ultimate decision maker anyway? And is this more open-ended for conversation? Is it personal or professional, right? What's the level of emotion that's in this conversation that we're having? I think that there is a difference. Or is this one of those things where we're calling it negotiation, but really at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is mediate, right? Is this an interpersonal challenge and we're just trying to get a better point of understanding? Or, so I think that there's a lot of those sort of stage setting calibration pieces. And the other thing that I think matters at the very beginning is who's mediating or facilitating a negotiation. I think the difference of who is at the crux of those conversations, and to the points that all of my colleagues have just made through the various questions, how good are they at open-ended questions? How good are they at listening to what the answers are? How good are they to understanding what people are bringing to the table from a cultural and personal perspective? It changes the fate of that conversation for the parties participating. So I think if you are either participating or asked to facilitate one of these conversations, having some role clarity for yourself and why you're in the seat you're in. Are you good at this? Should you be more conscious of things you're not as great at going into it? I think matters before anybody has even started to negotiate anything. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
Jonathan, anything to add?
I would just add that to both Nicholas's and Marty's comments that as the lawyer at the table, oftentimes the first consideration is actually answering the questions that Marty just asked, but with your client before even going into the negotiation room. So there's probably another full day discussion about strategies for negotiating when you already entered a conflict, which is usually when I would be involved from a work standpoint. But understanding that your client has to sometimes be persuaded, one, as to what's an appropriate outcome, two, as to sometimes what are the costs of continuing down a path when maybe compromise is maybe the better option. But those are the types of things that from where I usually sit at the table, that's usually where we start. And we begin with the end in mind to the extent we can. But to Marty's point, the beginning is far before the scheduled mediation. It should be, if we have the time, months and months in advance of the scheduled mediation, if really the outcome and the goal is to reach a compromise with, usually when I'm involved, with an opponent.
Thank you. And Randy?
I think Nicholas, Marty, and Jonathan did such a great job answering that question that I would just be repeating their great answers. So I'll leave it at that.
Sounds good. So we did have a couple of follow-ups in our chat here. So I think this one might be for Nicholas. As far as negotiation goes, what type of open level questions would you suggest? Can you provide us with some examples?
So one example would be why is there interest, and genuinely mean it as an open-ended question versus questioning that someone has ulterior motives or anything like that. Or ask a direct question in terms of why you're interested in this. What are the typical gains or atypical gains you may get out of this? You might have personal agenda driving a negotiation. Someone's going to get a raise or get a bonus or get a promotion if they negotiate that asset that you're talking about successfully. So try to understand what is behind everyone's driver, kind of what Marty has alluded to. Understand their come from. What do they gain from a successful negotiation? What do you lose from a non-successful negotiation? And also ask them, what can be the common grounds that we have? Because usually you'll find in a lot of negotiations that you have more common grounds to agree on than not. So find out what those are and agree on those early on, and then leave the outliers to later on, and then figure something out with them. So, and then I'm a very direct person. So, but I ask the question in a way that, hey, I preface it, I'm going to ask you a direct question right here, but here's what I'm thinking, and here's the question that I have for you. What is your feedback for me? I always preface that when I ask something during a negotiation.
Thank you. So our next question here is, what are some ways to distance our emotions from a difficult conversation? Randy, you want to get us started on that one?
Well, I guess it kind of depends. Is it a personal conversation that you're having, or is it a business conversation? Because that's going to make it more challenging. I don't think you can ever distance your emotions from it. At least I can't. I think the best you can do is be cognizant that when your emotions rise within you, recognize that that's happening and decide how to deal with that. If you can, give yourself a little bit of space. You don't ever want to make any kind of critical decisions if you're in a elevated emotional state, typically. But a lot of times it's just being aware that your emotions are running high, and before you answer something or take a position, you just need to check yourself. Am I doing this because of an emotional response, or am I doing this because this is really how I want the outcome of this negotiation to go?
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add on to that one?
I'll just say it also depends on what the emotion is that you feel. So if the emotion is anger, then I would almost always recommend that you try to replace a bit of that anger with empathy, because that can help to cool the temperature in any room.
Just a little tips and tricks. I love what Jonathan has said with empathy. I found myself an extremely emotional person, and whenever I sense and I'm present that I'm feeling anger or something that may not align to the benefit of the negotiation, I always ask for, hey, let's take a 10-minute break off so I can go and take a very deep breath and get myself centered and grounded and come back in the negotiation and negotiate objectively, not when something that a button got pushed with me. So there's always that break that you can take, and when you start recognizing those feelings and being present to yourself, just ask for a break. I'm assuming a lot would love to have that, and they'll find that the negotiation will have a different momentum when everybody takes a little break and come back.
I fully echo that. I would say that having also patience with a negotiation, knowing in very few circumstances does it have to be resolved right now. Usually in business, there's a tomorrow, usually.
I'd also add that it is very helpful to have a good wingman like your attorney, Jonathan, there with you to recognize when you're perhaps going off the deep end, to gently grab your shoulder or suggest that maybe we step outside and discuss it further, because sometimes you need somebody to give you that space.
Thank you all. So is there ever a situation where conflict cannot be resolved? And if so, how do you recommend moving forward?
So I'll address that one from a slightly different perspective. So I've spent a lot of years as on parts of human resources senior leadership teams. And what you're having in those conversations isn't always a negotiation or a compromise. They are indeed sometimes just difficult conversations with messages that are sometimes a little bit harder to hear and a little bit harder to deliver. But in scenarios like that, where you are talking about a corporate policy, there is a difference in standing up for the ethics and the ethos of an organization. There is sometimes conflict that cannot be resolved. In a perfect world, the person who you're delivering that message to you can hear it, is taking an opportunity to internalize it, and there is opportunity to grow from there. And sometimes fundamentally, they're not ready to hear it and be a part of that. So how do you move forward? And I think in an environment like that, especially if there are human resources implications, et cetera, first of all, there are some scenarios where you don't move forward, right? There are things where if a behavior is egregious, it is in flat out violation of, what you're going to consider what is a standard. This is not how we treat people. This is not the values we stand for. You don't. You actually end that conversation. And then there's a separate one that follows that. If you're at a point where you can have it and people say, okay, I hear you, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know where they're going with that. So on and so forth. The moving forward is finding actionable next steps where you need those people in that conversation to put actions to the words they're hearing, right? And I think this resonates with a couple of the questions that are in here about reconciling ideology and having politically correct and reality conversations. This is where the participants have the opportunity to put their money where their mouth is, right? Okay, if you hear what I'm saying about this conflict, what are 3 things you're going to do going forward? And you create an action plan, and it has deliverables attached to it. And then there's check-ins and accountability attached to that. And it doesn't mean the conflict is solved. It doesn't mean that everybody there has forgiven everybody else and that we've moved on from that. But what it means is we are in agreement on this is how we are, or we may not be, but here's how we are going to move forward. And here are the steps we're going to take to get there. And then that way, if you find that it's somebody who's repeating bad behavior or saying one thing and doing another, you have an opportunity to be like, we have agreed upon these steps, or this is what is expected of you as an employee in this organization. And we go from there. And there's obviously things like progressive discipline and actions related to that, etc. But there's not always resolution in those scenarios. You have interpersonal differences. There are things that need to happen. You still need an action plan that gets you out of that to where you go going forward.
Thank you so much, Marty. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
Just one little thing to echo what Jonathan has said earlier. There's never absolutes. There's always a tomorrow. There's a lot of situation where you cannot resolve it today. What I personally do is I take personal account of what worked and didn't work during a negotiation. Not everything in a negotiation is bad. What scored points, what didn't, and consider it that we lost the battle, but we didn't lose the war. Because eventually in business, those parties are going to get together. If the reason why they're negotiating, there's a common ground there to be had. And more than likely, they're going to get together again at the same table in the future. And it's very good to have the history of what happened during previous negotiations and try to repeat the ones that worked and try to avoid the ones that didn't. And maybe you're negotiating under different circumstances. So there's no absolutes in my mind. There's always the possibility of different outcomes in the future. It's just we did not win today. Let's go out and do the best that we can and hope that we can do it better tomorrow.
So Marty touched a bit on the topic of politics, but our next question here is, what is your advice to handle situations that are politically correct, but the actual reality is not? Randy, you want to get us started on that one?
Oh yeah, thanks for that. Okay, I've been looking at that question and thinking of some of my own experiences. I certainly had an employee that had some very strong political opinions that permeated most every discussion that he had, and he was very disruptive to the group, quite frankly. And we had to have conversations with him to tone it down, and it was uncomfortable, but it put the whole group on edge. So it's something that had to be addressed. I'm not exactly sure what the nature of this question is, because politically correct covers such a wide span anymore. It's very hard to say what that means. But I think just as a general tenet of leadership, and something that we've said over and over again, is being transparent, being genuine, and being willing to listen to all sides and reflect upon that and internalize some of these things is helpful. And something that Jonathan said also is empathy. So if you can have some empathy and put yourself in that person's shoes and maybe understand a little bit about where they're coming from, the political correctness might be a little easier to tolerate.
So this next question is kind of within this area. Is it possible to resolve conflicts if the in the professional setting if the reason is an ideological conflict? Marty, maybe you want to add something to this one?
Sure. So I think my short answer is it depends, right? It depends on your organization. It depends on what the conflict is. There is one end where, depending on your leadership, your culture, and what the conflict is, there are things that there is not resolving of conflict. There are certain ways that you do not treat people. There is certain behavior. There's that trust and transparency. And sometimes there are things that break those that you do not come back from. And then we do not necessarily resolve it. Sometimes there are talk about a different reason for a difficult conversation about if you are not a good ideological fit for an organization for a wide variety of reasons, not all of which are good or bad, right? That's not a judgment statement, just sometimes that you're not aligned with where your organization is headed. We don't resolve them, right? We decide that the resolution is a separation and you move to do something that is a better fit. On the other hand, if they're coming, and so that's all, of course, the hard line, like HR pieces of that answer. On the other side of it, this is a brilliant conversation for opportunity for productive conversation, for education, for open-mindedness, for learning from one another, and perhaps finding reasons to be aligned, and maybe the ideology is not as far apart as you would have thought. There is opportunity to evolve as an organization and understand the ideology or clarify it even better going forward, that it's needed to be updated, or it needs a more timely response or vernacular around it. Out of those conflicts comes really productive conversations and perhaps a new product or service or working group or working style or identified needs that leadership really needs to address and hasn't had the chance to do so holistically or in earnest. So I think that, again, right, depending on if you're glass half full or glass half empty, sometimes those ideological conflicts are the start of the most important things that can happen in a culture. And sometimes they're coming from a place of, we draw the line and that's that. So I know that's a really wishy-washy answer to that question, but it's very open-ended, and I want to be really very positive about it and really very it's not always a bad answer to say this is not an ideological fit.
And I'll echo what Marty said, and also something as Marty, as you were speaking, what came to my mind is when I think about my own stage, I'm still considered, and I consider myself to be a young professional. Sometimes in an organization, and it could be where you actually are employed, it could be where you serve in the community, it could be any number of places where people come together. Sometimes in an organization, the ideological concern that you have could just be a leadership lane for you to be the change maker and to be a leader. So there are for sure those things that are non-negotiables. And those things, sometimes there's a hard line you have to draw. But short of that, in the gray area of conflict and of ideological difference, in almost every human interaction, a disagreement or a difference of perspective or a difference of background is an opportunity for change. And so if you as a grad student or an early stage professional start to view those opportunities as opportunities, then they could be great platforms for you to develop a stronger relationship with the people in charge of your organization, and ultimately to end up a person with a platform for leadership because you saw this difference. And instead of approaching it with anger or with aggression, approached it with grace and with empathy and as an opportunity to serve.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the one other word that I would want to throw into that conversation is if you take assumptions and replace them with empathy, right? You know, a lot of people make a lot of assumptions about what's going through the minds and hearts of lots of others. That's a bad place to start. That is not a good answer for that productive conversation, or finding a gap that you can fill, or finding that platform for your own leadership and executive presence. It's just a bad place to start. So if anybody finds themselves at the source of a conflict because you made a lot of assumptions about what was happening on the other side of the table, that's a good opportunity to take a very big step back and start with your statement in the form of a question.
I want to echo what Mari and Jonathan said. I worry a lot when my most passionate people in the room are quiet because they cannot voice their point of view or their ideas. Kind of what Marty said, as long as it's not a deal breaker, you want to channel that passion towards something that is productive for everyone. They're passionate about that a certain ideology because, and then explore that further. And kind of what Jonathan said, it's an opportunity for leadership. Put those people in charge. If that ideology is not in conflict with your core values, with the North Star of the company, there's an opportunity for real change driven by people that are passionate about that change. So I would always take advantage of that and then put them in positions where they can make a change or at least implement something.
Thank you so much. Just wanted to remind everyone that we have about 10 more minutes, so please write your questions in the chat if you have any for our panelists. So our next question here is, if we are in a situation where we have to make a final decision, maybe a fast approaching deadline, and there's just no time for debate or compromise, can you discuss a bit about how you would handle the situation and the conflict or backlash that comes from making that decision? And maybe Randy, you can start us off.
Well, that happens almost every day at some level, right? You never have all the information you want to have. You never have enough time to do the analysis that you want to have. Sometimes, if you have the opportunity to get your team together, you can hash out. You can say, "This is what my decision. This is the decision I'm leaning towards," and you can hash it out quickly. Kind of assess the fallout. But sometimes you just have to trust your gut. Sometimes you have to fall back on your experience and you have to make the decision. Now, the key to that is having that rapport with your team that we talked about in question 1, to where your team has your back, and you have your team's back, because maybe it's one of your subordinates that has to make that decision, and you want to know that sometimes it's okay to fail. I think we've said before that in business there's always a tomorrow. Rarely are these decisions life or death. It doesn't mean they're not serious, but you know, even if you have to make that call on the fly, usually you know there's an opportunity to set things right down the road if for some reason it goes horribly wrong. The thing is you rarely learn something if it goes right. You learn stuff when things go wrong, so you're going to make those decisions that are not going to work out, and sometimes they fail spectacularly. And having your team around you to kind of rehash what we could have done better and learn from it and move forward is you know, some of the best development experiences you have. If you make one of those decisions on the fly and it fails and you get your head handed to you, what is that? That's teaching you to never make a decision again, and that's really not what you want to do with your leadership.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you want to add anything?
Not anything substantive. It's kind of funny. In my prior job, I was a prosecutor for the Department of Justice, and so the on-the-fly decision making would oftentimes happen in court. So whereas I may feel like I needed a night to prepare for something, a judge may say, "Mr. Osborne, you have 10 minutes. Your closing argument begins after the water break." And so all I would say, to echo what Randy said, is 2 things. I'd say, 1, to the extent that you can, I'd say work in environments where you believe in the mission of the organization and in your leadership. And so that is, you can have confidence that when you step out on that ledge, you will have the support of your team. And then 2nd, I would say practice. And then 3rd, believe in yourself. And if you have those three on a loop, you'll at least make it to tomorrow.
Thank you. That's great. So we just got another question in our chat, and it's, what is your advice when you feel the person you have a difficult conversation with is not listening to you while you are right about your idea? Because maybe he or she is the boss, and that level of trust is not where it should be. Who wants to start us off on that one?
I will take that one. To start us off. What I see in there is a ready-made conflict that I think is not uncommon for a lot of a lot of energetic professionals that really want to be heard in those conversations, and experiences that either first time or experienced managers have when they're hearing that input. And I think that there are two sides to this conversation depending on which seat you're in. The first is from the perspective of the question. What when you feel that the person is not listening because you feel that you're right. Well, there's two concepts there, right? The first is you're not feeling heard, which is a very fair thing to be saying, etc. The second is the assertion that you are already the right answer about this. And you probably are, by the way. I'm not actually negating that at all. But I think what needs to happen here is the closing of the gap of, is that because your boss does not trust the decision making that's happening at your level? Has this something that has been tried before? And how many different ways have we tried to present that idea or concept? Are we presenting it as, I'm right and here's what we need to do? Are we presenting it as, and by the way, I'm not saying that all of these are right. I'm just saying that trying different tactics helps to narrow down whether or not, if it's really my boss doesn't trust that I am too junior in this, asking in the form of the questions, have we tried before, etc., those types of things. Or sometimes it's okay to ask, do you not want this input from me at this point in my career? Is there a point where you'd prefer to hear this, right? It's okay to frame up the conversation and ask some fair questions that are not accusatory, that help understand where you can engage without making assumptions about it. It's also fair in forums that we're allowed to ask, provide 360 feedback, etc., that sometimes you aren't feeling heard when you're making that sentence. And it makes you feel like, right, there's always the I feel words, etc., versus the accusing versions, where I feel like my ideas are not necessarily considered because of where I sit in the organization. And I think there are 5 generations in the workplace right now. And I think that the understanding of hierarchy, the understanding of where ideas can come from, the understanding of the which they can be escalated through a flat or hierarchical organization really create this conflict in a lot of organizations every single day. And I think that learning on both sides of that and framing differently sometimes helps get heard. And it doesn't mean that the idea moves forward and that we win the battle or the war, but it does mean that there's probably a good place to have it. And sometimes it's one of those things, that conflicts that doesn't get resolved, or you say, you know what, my boss is not hearing me. Do you have another advocate in the organization? Do you have a different avenue or a sponsor or a mentor or somebody that's helping to develop you professionally overall? That's a good person to say, I've been thinking about this. How do you think I should propose it to my boss? Do you think this idea has any merit for me to propose it differently? So there's those types of opportunities too.
Thank you so much, Marty. Does anyone else want to add anything?
Nicholas? I would just say, on a parallel track, especially if you are an early stage professional, it's incumbent on all of us to earn trust too. So just because you're not the person who's in charge, I think on one hand, you should identify the challenges that you see, the problems, the disagreements that you have. But at the same time, on a parallel track, you should be demonstrating that you are trustworthy and earning the buy-in from your colleagues around you. Maybe someone will go to your boss and say, hey, this person over here is a star. Have you asked him or her what they think about how to improve our organization? So it's not always the direct conversation with management that gets problem solved. Sometimes it's demonstrating capacity to lead. Other times it's like Marty said, working with a network of other people who may see things your way to trickle up change.
Right. And great input from both of my colleagues. The one thing is, yeah, the trust is not there, but also I've been in that situation many times where I've been said no to, and then in my retrospective after those saying being said no to, it's like, do I understand what makes my boss tick? Does that person needs 100% of the information before they make a decision, or they can make a decision on the fly? It's just understanding who you're talking with. And the other thing is, find out who in your team was successful at passing through some agenda items and going in there and it's like, here's what I'm up against, and here's what the problem is, and I want to present it to my boss. What is your advice? And then you might potentially get into a situation like Jonathan proposed, where that person is your advocate. The more advocates you have within your organization and surround that boss, whether his boss or people that are his peers or people that are his direct reports but a different level of trust, if you surround the opportunity, then your chances of getting it through can go a whole lot better than just keep butting heads and feels like insanity. Because I've been through a lot of insanity situations, keep doing the same thing and getting the same results, or gotta do something different.
I totally agree. I love what you said there, and I really like what Jonathan said too. Managing upward is an important skill for any professional to have. Know who your boss is, know what makes them tick, and what they like, what they don't like, so you can build that rapport with them. But also go sideways. Talk to your peers. If you think the idea has merit, talk it out with your peers, because they will give you some good advice. Because let's face it, maybe the idea just really isn't that good, or maybe it's half of a good idea and they can give you the other half. And you work that out and you present your boss with something that's been really fleshed out and thoughtful, and you can tell them who you've gotten on board and what their feedback is. That's a much easier conversation to have without making your boss feel like you've gone around them or over them. If you can present it that you're bringing them something that has been very well thought out and vetted by other people, that's a much easier conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today, but thank you so much for sharing your time with us and providing this great applicable advice. It was such a beneficial conversation for all of us, no matter what stage of life we're in, whether we're working or we're in school. And just thank you for sharing such applicable advice to all of us. Thank you for all of our participants for joining us for another workshop. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Before you all log off, I'm just gonna type in here a quick feedback survey for you if you have just 2 minutes to fill it out. This helps us with our future workshops, lets us know what to bring back and what we can change. All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.